spent years building tunnels underneath the Texas-Mexican border. We come in, and this might be fair or unfair, but on a per capita basis, kill about 30,000 Americans and then take 5,000 back and hide them in tunnels under Mexico. And the question I was asked is, what would we do? And I believe our response would make Israel's response look gentle. Is that fair?
I don't think it is entirely fair. I mean, I'm just thinking about the wars that I've watched.
David, where does this podcast find you?
I am in my home in Northwest Washington. This is the place where I write many of my columns and all of my fiction.
So let's bust right into it. Your new book, Phantom Orbit, is a thriller about an invisible enemy that can disrupt the satellite signals central to our daily lives. So let's start there. Give us an overview of what this novel is trying to tell us, or what it illuminates about the current state of play in technology and geopolitics.
So this is a novel about the way in which space weapons, space warfare are coming to dominate warfare more broadly. I've become convinced in 4 visits to Ukraine that Ukraine is really the first space war. I can explain that in a minute. But the book opens with a Russian astrophysicist, not a defector, not a traitor, but somebody who's come to believe that Russia and China developed the ability to essentially have a kill switch that can disable the GPS system on which American communications, every one of our cell phone calls, our air travel, our travel of every sort depend. And he tries to communicate that to the United States, thinking he has a responsibility to do so. And the CIA doesn't want to respond, doesn't get back to him. And through the book, one of the mysteries is why the CIA isn't dealing with this warning that he's making. But more broadly, it's a book about what I think is the future of warfare, maybe the future of commerce as well, which is systems in space.
So I immediately go to, there's one person who doesn't report to any government, who doesn't work for the government, I would argue hasn't shown a great deal of fidelity to any specific commonwealth, who I believe owns and controls 51% of the satellites in orbit. Do you see that as a risk?
So I assume you're talking about Elon Musk. And
Correct.
let's just talk for a minute about Musk. I do think there's a risk there, but I want to underline why he and the systems he runs are so important. So as you say, Starlink today has roughly 5,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. They're able to provide broadband internet coverage for pretty much the whole world. Specifically, they're able to provide broadband internet coverage for the Ukrainian military in its forward positions, without which I don't think they could operate. So he and his system are crucial for Ukraine's survival. He could decide tomorrow that he's sick of this forever war in Ukraine. He wants to sell Teslas, make Teslas in China, and pull out. There are some limits on his ability to do that because he has a contract with the Pentagon. But as the United States grows more and more dependent on our tech ecosystem to provide low-cost satellite launch, incredibly interesting new systems that do what our spy agencies could once do only now for everybody. Those private sector business people have much more leverage over our national security policy, and I do worry what happens if one day they change their minds. We're putting a lot of eggs in their basket.
So we talk a little bit about the underlying technology, phones, and I mean, there's some technologies that have just advanced incredibly, at a rapid pace, others not so rapid. Describe the technology around satellites, and has the cadence of innovation there matched, underwhelmed, superseded advances in other types of technology? And what does that mean practically? Why are the satellites now, what are they capable of that they weren't capable of, say, 10 or 20 years ago?
So I think the most important aspect of this is the way in which costs have lowered because of competition, because of our entrepreneurial ecosystem. So just briefly reviewing in our minds the history of space. Grew up in a world where Russia, when I was 7 years old, launched the first satellite and then had the first cosmonaut in space. We were behind. The United States had an incredible catch-up effort. We put men on the moon. Nobody has equaled that to this day. There was the era of the space shuttle. We were totally dominant. But then, for some reason, the United States lost interest in space. And to the point that we had to buy launch capability for satellites from other countries. We just didn't have the rockets to put big satellites in orbit. Russia supplied that for a time. And then along came commercial space, along came Elon Musk. And with SpaceX, the history of trying and trying and trying and finally getting it right, he has extraordinary low cost launch capability, and that's been matched by others in the industry. So the things you can do in space cheaply, it's a much broader array. The communication satellites that are beaming broadband internet down to Earth, I don't think were imagined 10, 15 years ago. 5,000 satellites is a lot. Amazon's about to put 2,000 at least of its own in space to do its business. There are other companies around the world that are jumping into this as well. So the cost advantage is significant. All this stuff is in low Earth orbit. It's very vulnerable. The Russians have just, our intelligence community says, been thinking about the mismatch between all that we have and the little that they have, and saying, if we needed to take out those low Earth orbit satellites, we could use a nuclear weapon. We could just create a debris field in low Earth orbit, so nothing could pass, really for a generation. So that's the vulnerability. But on the basic question you're asking, GPS was a brilliant idea that was developed initially for national security purposes and just got better and more refined year by year. Russia tried to copy it from the beginning. It was very, very poor, had nothing like the resolution fidelity that the US had. China has a system called Beidou that they've been working on very hard. It's pretty good, but it's not as good as GPS. Um, Europe has its own system. India has a system. Japan has a system. Everybody knows this is the backbone of everything that you do, but it's vulnerable. It's vulnerable to attack. It's vulnerable to spoofing, other mischief that can be done to interfere with the satellite. So I think one thing I want to do in this book is get people thinking about the technologies that are part of everyday life. I mean, who doesn't go a moment without a cell phone? But without a GPS to locate where that phone is and allow it to work and exchange signals, the system would be untenable, wouldn't work.
So, a couple thoughts listening to you talk about this. One, they're vulnerable, but so are civilian populations. Isn't part of this process to communicate to adversaries that an attack on our satellites would be like an attack on a civilian population that would be an act of war? Or do you think it's more realistic to develop technologies that make these things stealthy and more difficult to take out?
So I think our vulnerability is greater because our dependence on these systems is greater. It's asymmetric in that sense. That's why Russia thinks if we obliterated everything in low Earth orbit, we'd suffer, but the Americans and the West would suffer more. So that's why the balance of terror prevails in nuclear weapons may not be as applicable. I think hardening satellites, I think developing redundancy, I think finding ways to avoid vulnerable communications from satellites to Earth through the kind of thing that Starlink has. Starlink uses mesh networks in space. You've got 5,000 satellites spinning around. They're creating their own internet, as it were, in space using mesh networks up there to exchange signals so that they can download them to Earth at the most appropriate, opportune time. Technology like that are really helpful. We now have a space force that's first job is to figure out what's up there. What among the hundreds and hundreds of satellites might have attack capability by monitoring not just from Earth but close up. to take a look, and they've seen some extraordinary things, which I try to describe in the book. The very cleverly configured Chinese seemingly attack satellites, Russian satellites that are structured like Matryoshka dolls, where a little satellite pops out of a big satellite and then goes toward the target. So then the Space Force will think, how do we harden the system so they're less vulnerable? Another thing we haven't talked about is the ability to use high-powered microwaves or lasers to beam malware into satellites from a distance without people on Earth necessarily being aware that that malware had been implanted, that it could be activated in a time of crisis. So you want to harden satellites against that kind of risk. And then finally, inevitably, the U.S. will want its own offensive capability in space. I have no idea what that's going to be. This is the most classified area I've ever encountered as a journalist, as a writer, to try to penetrate. You just don't get answers when you ask, okay, like what weapons are you developing? But I'm sure they're developing some.
I had one of those aha moments in technology. I remember the first time I bought something on my BlackBerry or took a picture of a check and it automatically showed up in my checking account. I had one of those moments, I think about a month or 2 months ago. I was on a plane and I used Starlink. And within 2 minutes of connecting to Starlink, I got a call on my phone and the quality, it was FaceTime, and the FaceTime call was perfect on a plane. I mean, it really is powerful.
It's amazingly good technology.
Yeah, it's just it's intoxicating. And a few days before, I had flown over the west coast, or excuse me, the east coast of Florida, and saw a Starlink or a SpaceX rocket flying into space. I'm like, you just got to give it to this guy. I mean, he's not doing a photo sharing app. He's putting satellites into space. But wouldn't the rest of the world pray for our problems, in the sense that our vulnerabilities and our problems are a function of the fact that we're dominating this final frontier? We're 25% of global GDP. We have the biggest military in the world, but I think we're maybe 40 or 50% of the world's military, maybe a little bit more than that. But it feels like we just dominate space. Isn't this an example of how America is leapfrogging ahead?
So this is an example of the continuing dynamism of the American technology sector, as is the creation of large language models. Most things in technology, we're not as far behind as we worried we were. I think my response would be, in a characteristically American way, we end up sharing the technology that we create with the world, and it enhances the world's ability to do the things that we do. The internet was created in the United States initially for very limited purposes, to share defense information among different labs. We ended up sharing that with the world, and encouraging a governance system through ICANN that was not controlled by government, but was controlled by people who were technically competent, who knew how to protect the system. We made it open. In that, I mean, sadly to me, one paradox of the modern world is that super open communication system that we created and gave the world ends up empowering closed societies that can control it, and adding a degree of instability to open societies that can't control it. Who could have predicted that? But that's the way it turned out. But we continue, as with GPS is a perfect example. This was an American idea. It was developed initially in secret. We shared the technology with the whole world. Everybody's got one. Everybody's better off for having one. We don't say boo about it. I think the main thing that the U.S. tries to do is get some order and regulation for space. Those things don't bump into each other. That whole command and control system for space, the U.S. runs. We're trying to spin off parts of it. But again, I think our problem is we create these fantastic technologies and then become vulnerable to them. Look at internet hacking. Look at the vulnerability of everything we do in the United States to the assaults on the technology that we created. What do we do about that? We don't stop creating the technology, but we do need to think more about how to protect it.
You said it's sort of the intersection of these technological developments and geopolitics. If you were, what do you see as the biggest threat? Maybe it's more than one. Is it some sort of malware? Is it a cyber attack? Is it a war in space? Is it AI becoming sentient and super weapons? If you were to try and guess what are the most frightening potential headlines we might read in the next 2 or 3 years that involve technology, what is your best guess?
So, on the purely technological front, I think I do worry about the speed of warfare as AI systems increasingly make decisions, because with hypersonic missiles, the decision time for human beings isn't there. So I'd liken it to what DeepMind or AlphaGo did to playing chess or Go. So as I understand it, AlphaGo understands every move that any human being ever made on a Go board, and then can think of any move that could be made that no human being ever thought of. Same thing with chess. It's not just a compendium of every move in the past that was made. It's something much more creative than that. So applied to warfare, a system that with that power could think of strategies, vulnerabilities, ways to exploit weakness that even the most aggressive military planners couldn't think of. And I know the person who was worried most about this before he died was Henry Kissinger. I talked to Kissinger at length. Kissinger wrote a couple of books about it, that AI presented enormous opportunities in ways we all know, but from his perspective, as somebody who'd spent really his whole career thinking about arms control, the real threat now wasn't the weapons, but the AI systems that would drive use of the weapons. And as he died, that was the thing topmost in his mind, and he was right.
So give us, you cover these conflicts. Give us your sense of the state of play of Ukraine or the war in Ukraine right now. It feels like we've been distracted with a bunch of other things and haven't spent that much time thinking about it.
So, just to briefly describe Ukraine, as it seemed to me just over a month ago when I was last there, um, I visited with President Zelensky. It's always inspiring. In this case, it was inspiring and depressing. He described a situation where he was still then waiting for congressional approval of the weapons, and he said, "If we don't get them, we have no choice but to retreat." And he drew me a little map of the battlefield and said, "We have 2,000 rounds a day. The Russians have 8,000. We just can't hold these lines." As he drawn them, we have to shrink them. We have to take some of our positions out. So that was happening. I fear it's happening now. If you read the news, the Russians are advancing in the east while they wait for the weapons to arrive. When the Ukrainians get the weapons that we're sending them, I think the wisest course for them is to consolidate their positions, to make sure the Russians don't gain any more territory, and prepare for next year offensive operations that could begin to push the Russians back. The Russians are in it for the long haul, too. They just put in place a team in their defense ministry that's going to be about a war economy for as far ahead as we can imagine. Putin isn't giving up. So for me, the thing, sadly, that people need to focus on is giving Ukraine the resources to keep fighting as long as it's willing to pay that cost, until it can get to the point where it has the leverage to push the Russians and the Chinese toward negotiations for a just negotiated settlement. I can't describe what that would look like. But there's let me tell you one other thing about what you see in Ukraine, which is interesting, I think, to your listeners. Ukraine has developed an incredible entrepreneurial ecosystem. Um, Ukrainians are making their own drones now that can reach far into Russia. They have attacked 200 miles east of Russia. In one case I read about recently, they've taken out roughly 15% of Russia's refining capacity. They're building drones because Russia's gotten better at EW, electronic warfare, that can jam the signals that allow guidance and successful targeting by drones. They're putting AI at the edge in their drones. They're cheap little drones. They make them in furniture stores. They're just kind of cheap little wood, but they fly. And then they're putting very sophisticated AI systems that can map the terrain. And even if they're cut off from any communications with satellite guidance or with their home base, can still get to their targets. They're doing that on their own largely, some American entrepreneurs, and it's the Ukrainian War has become, if you remember from your history, the Spanish Civil War, the International Brigade. In Kiev now, there are entrepreneurs from all over the world. I met Australians, Portuguese, lots of Americans, and they're just coming there to help the Ukrainians think of ways to survive. It's a fascinating little world. It deserves more good journalism to describe it. So, with technology, their technology is really good, and they have stayed ahead of the Russians. I think they can stay in the field, to come back to my point, until they have enough power to negotiate with Russia from a position of strength.
Now, talk a little bit about your sense of the war in Gaza and how technology is playing out there.
So, technology's failures in Gaza, Israel's technology superpower, Israel's technology, it appears from New York Times reporting, was sufficient that they captured plans for what Hamas will do on October 7th. But human failure, the inability of senior intelligence officers to take seriously what junior intelligence officers had seen in the collection, is part of the tragedy. October 7th, that Israel just didn't see it coming. Israel didn't see the trench system, the underground metro, as they call it, the tunnels. I mean, it turns out in this tiny area, Gaza is like 25 miles long and 7 miles wide. In that tiny area, there are 350 miles of tunnels. Imagine that, just crisscrossing at every level. Israel didn't really have an adequate sense of that. And I'm working a column today about Israel beginning to think about an end game that doesn't obliterate Hamas. That may not be possible, but begins to develop alternative non-Hamas governance in Gaza, which means turning to the people Netanyahu hates, or the Palestinian Authority. But there are a lot of Israelis, especially in the IDF, who think that's the only way to go. I share that view.
How do you think this thing, if you were to try and play it out, and you've written about, okay, what about the day after? How, if you had to speculate, this plays out, and then what does it look like after there's some sort of resolution?
So I think the first thing is to realize that Rafah, in a sense, has been overplayed by both sides. Israel does not at present have the military forces for an all-out assault on Rafah. This is more noise than it is an actual attack plan. Every time the U.S. says we don't think you should attack Rafah, Netanyahu seems to think, Prime Minister Netanyahu seems to think he has to say, "I'm going to attack Rafah." But there aren't those plans at present, and people in the IDF agree with people in the U.S. government that doing this carefully, not necessarily in a rush, makes sense. And they understand more to the point that unless you've thought clearly about how you're going to maintain order once you've cleared Rafah, I mean, you're not going to kill every Hamas fighter in Rafah, just as they didn't kill every Hamas fighter in Gaza City or Khan Yunis. They're still there, a lot of them. But they're not strong enough to threaten Israel. And if you create an alternative security presence, they're probably not strong enough to dominate Gaza going forward. A lot of Gaza Palestinians, I know from my reporting, do not like Hamas. So I think people are finally beginning to think about the day after issues, like what does stability look like in the long run in a way that is better for Israel, is better for the Palestinians. And that's turning the page to that point. It's taken 7 months, but that's where things ought to be. So, just say one final personal thing. I've been covering the Middle East a long time. I think Hamas has done enormous damage to the Palestinians. I think having sympathy for Hamas just doesn't make sense to me, given how they've operated. I think having sympathy for the Palestinian people and their suffering or aspirations for statehood and dignity is entirely appropriate. But Israel's goal of making sure that Hamas never governs Gaza again, I think that's something that makes sense for everybody, especially the Palestinians.
Well, just a couple theses, and you respond to them. One, I don't think a two-state solution, which I think most people agree is a decent goal, is possible with either Netanyahu or Hamas in charge. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And you said about having empathy and sympathy for the residents of Gaza. I mean, right now it's got the greatest concentration of child amputees in the world. I mean, it's horrific. Uh, and a lot of people, I've talked a lot about this issue, and a lot of people say, Scott, you need to differentiate between anti-Semitism and being anti-Israel and being anti-Semitic. And I think that's a fair statement because my understanding is about Netanyahu is about 30% support. So there's a lot of people in Israel that are kind of anti the current Israeli leadership. Where I don't think there's as much sharp relief as people say you can have a lot of empathy for Palestinians and be anti-Hamas, because my understanding is, I don't want to be clear, children, people under the age of 18, victims, humanitarian aid should absolutely, we need to protect it, make sure it gets there. But my understanding is Hamas actually has still a great deal of support among the Palestinian people, and that a lot of these houses that the IDF goes into have connections to tunnels, weapons, pictures of Hamas leaders that, just as we held the German people accountable for the Third Reich, is there really that much light in between the Palestinian people and Hamas?
So I think there's enough light and distance that equating the two and it's essentially imposing collective punishment on the Palestinians is wrong morally, and it's also wrong strategically. It's a guarantee for unending conflict. You're just not going. I mean, you're not going to kill all the Palestinians. They may hate you, but you got to find a way for them to have stable governance, and gradually over time things change. The U.S. in fact held the Nazi Party responsible for what happened in Germany. They held the Japanese war machine responsible for their war, but didn't hold the people of those two countries responsible, and indeed tried to help from a very early moment when the war ended, help those people begin to develop prosperity, democratic political systems. And today, to me, Japan and Germany are among the most successful democratic countries I know, precisely because we didn't impose collective punishment on the people. And I've been covering this, Scott, for it's way too long. Since 1980s, almost 45 years. I've lived in a Palestinian village. I went back to visit that village in December just to see the people who'd taken me in. And I'll say a couple things about them. One interesting thing about the West Bank is it hasn't blown up during this nightmare war. Everybody was afraid it would, but it hasn't. Why? Well, partly Palestinians, Israel sitting on them hard, but they don't want the disaster that Hamas brought to Gaza to happen to them. I may be naive in thinking that there's a way to a successful two-state solution. I know it'll take years. I know that both countries are really far from it. But I also know that if you don't start now, you're just going to be stuck. I've watched Israel and the Palestinians stuck in this misery for too long. I want it to move to a different place. I try to explain in my journalism how you do that, and spend the time going village to village in the West Bank just to make sure I'm not crazy. I'm not crazy to think that you could get to something better, and so that's what my reporting tells me.
For the purposes of pushback, and also not to prove a point, but to learn here, I have a tremendous respect for your domain expertise, and I am trying to keep an open mind about this. But when you say that we didn't hold the German and the Japanese people accountable, I would push back. We killed 3.5 million Japanese, including 100,000 in one night. 5.5 million Germans were killed by the Allies, including we continued to bomb in Hamburg and Dresden well beyond when it had strategic objective other than convincing them that they needed to know that they lost. And then holding the Palestinian people, the way you're framing it is that the Israelis are taking a more what I call inhuman approach to the Palestinians than the Allies did in World War II. And I disagree with that. And they're dropping leaflets, they're leaving voicemails. My sense is that they are doing their best to try and root out the combatants who Hamas, are using civilians as ammunition. Why is it you think that Israel is holding Palestinians to greater account than the Allies held the Germans or the Japanese? I don't see the data to support that.
So I take your point that during that all-out fight in World War II, the United States killed a lot of German and Japanese civilians. The United States position nominally was to limit civilian casualties, unlike the British that were conducting strategic bombing of Germany, meaning hitting cities. The U.S. position was, let's hit military facilities. But that got blurred, and I don't disagree in any way that the killing was horrific. There's evidence, Evan Thomas's new book about the road to surrender with Japan, it makes clear that Truman and Stimson thought that they were choosing a military target in Hiroshima. It wasn't. The aim point was right in the middle of town, killing civilians. But they thought they convinced themselves that they had ruled out what the military wanted to do, which was bomb Kyoto and shatter the symbol of Japanese culture and the civilians there, and they avoided that. So are we holding Israel to a different standard than we followed ourselves? Maybe. We live in a different time when you see war on your TV every day in a way you didn't during World War II. It's immediate and present and visceral. I've talked a lot to people in the IDF. I've covered Israel for all these decades. I have very good, long-standing contacts in the IDF, and I asked them, what accounts for the high level of civilian to Hamas casualties? And by most estimates, I know the Israelis are pushing back on this, but by estimates of U.S. intelligence, the ratio is unusually high and well beyond what we imposed after some time in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what accounts for that? What's going wrong? And when I asked that question, IDF, IAF, Israeli Air Force officers tell me about their rules of engagement, about the algorithms they use to try to reduce civilian casualties, but then they also tell me about the overrides that exist. I look at these numbers, Scott, and I think too many civilians have died relative to the number of fighters, more than was necessary. It's not to say that Israel is unique in that, doing things different from what the U.S. did during World War II. I'm not taking issue with that. But could they have done this differently? Could they do it differently right now as they plan the Rafah operation? Could they think carefully about how to reduce civilian suffering and death in this next phase? That's what the U.S. has been saying. And I think that that's the right question to ask. And I don't think that's a double standard at all. It's a standard. So some things that are being done that I just find abhorrent. There are Israelis who are blocking corridors of humanitarian assistance. They are not the IDF. The IDF is opening them up. There were police units reporting to right-wing members of this governing coalition who closed those corridors, and the IDF came in and opened them because they know it's not in Israel's strategic interest to do this. So the IDF hates settler violence in the West Bank. You know who the biggest enemy of that is? The IDF, because they've got to keep the lid on. And these crazy settlers who blow down from the mountaintops and, go on wearing masks and kill people in what they say are revenge attacks, that drives the IDF crazy.
And Tell me if you think this is an unfair question, but I want to pose it anyways because you really do sit at the intersection of warfare and DC and geopolitics. But the scenario I always imagine is a jihadist or radical cartel is elected to lead Mexico. And they incur into Texas under the auspices of you have been demonic to migrants. You've been putting our kids in cages. And it's based on this flawed, blasphemous ideology called evangelical Christianity. And we have an obligation to our God to come in, and we've gotten aid, and we've been spent years building tunnels underneath the Texas-Mexican border. We come in, and this might be fair or unfair, but on a per capita basis, kill about 30,000 Americans and then take 5,000 back and hide them in tunnels under Mexico. And the question I always ask is, what would we do? And I believe our response would make Israel's response look gentle. Is that fair?
I don't think it is entirely fair. I mean, I'm just thinking about the wars that I've watched. There was a nightmarish problem of ISIS violence that was sweeping across the Middle East, just truly horrific, pornographic violence, just crazy ways of killing people and, subjugating women in particular to beastly conditions. And the U.S. decided to fight back. So how did we do that? Well, the first thing we did was to get an ally, a local ally. The one thing we didn't do adequately in Iraq or Afghanistan, but we got people who were prepared to fight and die to do the operations on the ground. And so the first thing you'd think about with Mexico is there'd be a lot of people who would be potential allies, and you'd want to work with them. And then we thought about the need to move slowly and carefully. So the shaping of the operations against ISIS took months. People wondered, what the heck is the U.S. doing? Why is it taking so long? I remember I was able to go into Syria with the Special Operations Command repeatedly, and I kept thinking, why are we going faster? And the reason was to shape it carefully so that when you went in, it'd be quick and decisive. So they went in. The capital of ISIS was Raqqa. They didn't take Raqqa. They got all around it. They began recruiting tribes that had roots in Raqqa. They took the town next to Raqqa called Tabqa. They staged operations to squeeze. They began to get the civilians out of Raqqa, so the people in Raqqa mostly were the fighters. So when we say there's a better way to do this than the way you're doing it, we have some authority in making that claim. So how would we deal with Mexico? I mean, I don't know. But I mean, the right answer surely is we ought to find a way in that nightmare hypothetical scenario you describe to do a better job than Israel, tragically, with the greatest sympathy for the dilemmas they faced, than they did, because too many people died. We might be forced into that same situation. We might kill an equivalent number of people, but I hope we wouldn't have to, that we'd be smarter, and I hope Israel will be smarter.
David Ignatius is a prize-winning columnist for the Washington Post and has been covering the Middle East and the CIA for more than 4 decades. He's also written several New York Times bestsellers, including The Increment, Body of Lies, and Blood Money. His latest novel, Phantom Orbit, a thriller, is out now. He joined us from his home in Northwest Washington. David, I could have gone 2 hours here, and really do appreciate your measured, thoughtful view on these things and the way that you add texture. I found this really interesting and I learned from it. Appreciate your time.
I enjoyed the conversation too. They were tough questions.